So, Dr. Santhosh Mathew is the country lead of public policy and finance at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in New Delhi, in India. By background, he's a political economist. He has served the Indian Administrative Services for 32 years. Man, that is quite something. He's been the National Program Director for LEAD from 2000 to 2003, Principal Secretary of Rural Development, Government of Bihar, Joint Secretary Skills Policy and IT Ministry of Rural Development, Government of India, Chairperson of the National Council for Teacher Education, Government of India, and then Additional Chief Secretary, Government of Bihar. He's also a very sound academician. He's been professor of social management at Missouri, the Civil Services Training Academy from 1994 to 2000. He's a PhD in development studies from IDS Sussex, MSc in social research methods from University of Sussex, MA in economics from Delhi School of Economics. He's a member of board at the Global Innovation Fund, London, and Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational Research Institute at Belur, Howrah. This one is special for me, Santoshji, in case you don't know. I grew up in Calcutta, and this is an institute that I've been to many times myself, to Belur. My childhood was in Belur. And then after that, moved to Calcutta as my parents moved to Calcutta, and I learned French at the Ramakrishna Mission in my school days. So you brought some very interesting memories back. The last line is a reflection from me. I have always found Santoshji to be extremely astute, curious, and a deeply humane power pack. That's the way I look at him. I have learned enormously from him, and I'm looking forward to an amazing evening today. So, welcome, Santoshji, and looking forward to chat unfolding in front of us.
Thank you, Sanjay. Greatly looking forward to not just chatting with you, but all the wonderful people in the call.
Absolutely. You already have the background of the people who are on the call. They are societal platform associated mission leaders, either through the Aspire program that we have co-created along with Ashoka Fellows, or other mission leaders who have been associated with this idea. I wanted to begin with this picture. I don't know if you remember this picture. This is the first time I met you.
Yeah.
And Pramod is there, bang in the center. So Pramod, welcome again. And so, and next to you is me. It doesn't look like me anymore, but it was me at that point in time. This is 9th of August 2017, when we all met in Bangalore to start the brainstorming around the whole idea of our teachers, our heroes, and the entire digital infrastructure for education. A very memorable day, and there you are, as solid as ever. And Pramod is here, Shankar is here. And of course, after this, the other seminal moment I remember is 8th of November 2019, which was the first conversation we had on the civil services capacity building platform in Bangalore, which was called I Got Now Mission Karma Yogi. So with this as the starting point, I wanted to hear from you. What is it that attracts you to platform thinking? Why is it that we intersect with you when there are conversations around shared infrastructure, digital infrastructure, platforms, large scale change? Why do you get attracted to this very idea as an individual leader?
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. See, my many years in government has been at one level a litany of failures. But these are failures which have happened after either, typically it happens when one leaves the scene, not of crime, but the scene of intervention and of reform activity. For me, it was cathartic. It was 2004 that I decided that I'm not able to make sense of my work in the civil service. And that's when I took long leave and went away to do an MSc and a PhD. I spent 6 years doing that at Sussex in the UK, where for almost 6 years I was reflecting on this. And I came back a very different human being. And one thing that I came back more than ever deeply convinced is that our windows for reform are typically 6 to 18 months. And that is a coming together, as our dear friend, Mr. Anil Swarup, who was there in the picture, used to remind us, is a confluence of three things. It's political salience, administrative feasibility, and financial viability. That's a black swan moment, especially when you factor in that you need a reform champion, both in politics and in administration, to come together when these three things happen. And the window of opportunity is actually only 6 to 18 months. Now, how do you then engineer reforms in a way that is quick, that is sustainable, and that is typically to be had in a low capacity environment? This is what attracts me to digital infrastructure. The power of digital is the tyranny of digital. The tyranny is such that it is your way or the highway. It's the way something has been coded, so it's your way or the highway. So it actually, in one sense, imposes a tyranny. But on the other hand, it forces you to ex ante think of all the scenarios. And as code meets reality, you then need to be, you have that 18-month period to then prime it to make it viable. But remember, I'm using the word just digital infrastructure here. I've not yet added the S to digital, which is shared digital infrastructure. And why shared becomes important is that if you begin to build your digital infrastructure within the 18-month period, you will never be able to do anything. And that's why I find societal platforms as a construct, as one instance of shared digital infrastructure, so exciting. And that's why our paths keep intersecting. In the National Council for Teacher Education, one had a problem. There you are. Training of civil servants, one had a problem. There you are. And as you know, my new bug is actually doing a Uber on healthcare.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You have shared with us that given your experiences with the being with the government, working inside the entire system, that people think that the state is an institution, but actually you should look at the state as an organization. Tell us more about it. That's a very interesting perspective that our team here would love to learn more about.
So if you look at if you read the literature, particularly scholarly literature on the state, you will find that political economists or political scientists, economists, sociologists, anthropologists, these are the class of people who typically interrogate the state. And their understanding is of the state from the outside. And their main focus is largely either on the political process that leads to the creation and the leadership within the state apparatus, or the intersection between state and society. Now, people like me find that very interesting because it gives you frameworks within which you can understand from the outside of the state. But if you have to make the state work for common people, then you need a much deeper understanding of what's actually going on inside the state. I mean, for me, the analogy that comes to me is scholars groping the elephant. The skin is coarse, it is black, there's a tail, there's a trunk, there's a tusk. These are all what happens when you interrogate the state as an institution. So what happens when you interrogate the state as an institution? So you will come up with remedies such as give rights. So India, as you know, has got a fantastic rights framework. You have right to food. You have right to information. And these rights are typically very important, of course, But these rights are typically the product of thinking of the state as an institution. Whereas when you get inside the elephant, the endocrinal system, the muscular system, the digestive system, how these actually interact with each other, what are the pathologies inside? Why is it that the Indian state is unable to take the risks, for example, that the US took? There was not a vaccine in sight, yet so many million doses of vaccine were actually paid for. The Indian state, you will find, it'll be impossible for the Indian state to do that. What happens, because the kind of way that would be discussed inside would be, how can you place an order for something that doesn't exist? What happens if you place an order and the regulatory approvals don't come? What happens if you pay for something and there are adverse reactions? The risks associated with our rights framework is so high that the Indian state is unable to take those risky, so-called risky decisions. But as we now know, our inability to take those decisions at that time is costing us very dearly. So these pathologies can only be understood when you have an insider-outsider relationship with the state. When people who understand the state as an institution, when the political scientist is able to work alongside somebody who has worked within the state, or you have the anthropology of the state itself, the lived experience of people who man the state, that's when you get the depth of understanding. Businesses have solved this problem. If you look at a must MBA program, if you look at the case study literature, really what you are getting at there is millions of dollars spent in trying to understand businesses from inside. For me, the biggest example is what happened in the airline industry. One aircraft, the Malaysian airline system, the Airways Malaysian Airlines aircraft simply vanished. Millions of dollars were spent in trying to figure out what actually happened. We have everyday failures inside the state, which is costing us many Malaysian Airlines kinds of disaster. But where do we mass those resources to be able to understand what really is going on? And that's why I think it's important for us to be able to understand not just the state as an institution, but the state as an organization, how various factors interact with each other, how to reproduce in capacity and capacity. In fact, my own PhD thesis, as you're aware, is titled State and Capacity by Design, where I drew on econometric analysis and political science to be able to show that even when you have large swathes of incapacity, you can actually have high capacity in certain areas where the political momentum, the political requirement for that capacity does exist. And where it does exist, if the politics requires its destruction, then destruction of capacity is what you will get. Hence, it's really not mine. It actually is Devesh Kapoor, professor who used to lead the India Center at UPenn, who actually coined this whole difference of state as an institution versus state as an organization.
You also this is an amazing way of looking, or a different way of looking at how classically social entrepreneurs or mission leaders, as we call them, would look at the state. But you also characterize it in terms of the different types of problem, right? So you talk about the simple, complicated, complex problems, right? And in societal platform thinking, complex problems which are large and dynamic, which make them, as you know, uber complex, is the subject that we are trying to sort of deal with. And you have taken a very interesting perspective on how do you disaggregate the types of problems between which are the simple ones, which are the complex ones, which are the complicated ones, so that we don't, so to say, treat the wrong problems with the wrong approaches. So Share with us some examples around this, say maybe in the work in education or now what's happening, or even in health, whatever comes, some illustration to bring this to life for us.
As people who are interested in societal platforms and the whole digital area in general, I think it's very important for us to, or rather, it's not important. I mean, it will be very useful for us to draw a distinction between problems that are simple, complicated, and complex. And again, like I've drawn on the wisdom of Devesh Kapoor, here I draw on the wisdom of Atul Gawande and his now famous book, The Checklist Manifesto. That's where he brings in this three-way classification. And I find it extremely useful when interrogating the state as an organization. In my many years in government, as I look at problems, uh, I find that my view of the state is very different from the scholars' view of the state. The people who look at the state from the outside tend to, I believe, imagine that at least a significant portion of the problems that have to be solved within the state is actually complex. For example, let's take healthcare. Let's take a COVID patient. Oxygen levels are going down. A doctor has to decide whether that patient will be put on oxygen. If so, what is the rate of flow rate of oxygen that has to be administered? Does that person need steroids at this particular stage? Now, what's emerging is that if you give steroids too early, it actually kills the ability of the body to fight the infection. But once your lungs becomes compromised and you get a cytokine blast, then you have to control it through steroids, and that's when you get a fair chance to fight it back. So that timing becomes important. So that's, of course, there are protocols, but protocols are one thing, but that doctor examining the patient from various angles, the ability of drugs from various angles, competing demands from various angles, then comes to a conclusion. It's a complex one. But just look at that complex problem. For the doctor to be able to make that complex decision, there are at least 20 to 25 simple and complicated problems that needed to get solved. And what are they? First of all, there should have been a doctor. You take the presence of a doctor for granted. But remember, that's because somebody took a decision a while ago to recruit a doctor. Then just recruiting a doctor, no. The doctor will have to be precisely at the place where patients are required. How many times have you found buses that are running empty in some routes where buses have no space in other routes? It's an allocation problem, right? So that was solved. Oxygen. We now in India had a massive crisis of oxygen. And the problem was not that India did not produce enough oxygen. It's just that we had oxygen in the wrong place at the wrong time. Right. Okay. So the point that I'm making is that even in so-called complex problems, like I just now explained to you, it is like an iceberg. And hidden behind that complexity below the water, you have the very large mass of simple and complicated problems. Let's take, aircraft flying. This is what Gawande deals with, right? So Boeing, World War II, had one of the most successful fighter bomber programs of its time, but Boeing almost went bust. It had a fantastic aircraft, but the problem is pilots couldn't fly it. It used to crash. So they came out with nothing but a very simple checklist, which reduced the cognitive load, ensured you didn't miss anything. And by the deployment of a checklist, they were able to make an otherwise complex aircraft simple to fly. Now, 40 years later, that complex aircraft flown with the help of a checklist, what happened? You actually have fly-by-wire aircraft. Today's aircraft, the pilot is sitting there just to take care of unforeseen events. Otherwise, the aircraft pretty much flies itself. So do drones. So what we thought was actually complicated. You needed excellent pilots to fly a plane. Today, what you need is not excellent pilots, but pilots who can actually follow the drill. Because the plane pretty much pilots itself. Cars, we thought were complex problems. We need excellent drivers. Autonomous cars, what's it telling you? So if you actually unpack the so-called complicated problems, even where there is the tip of the iceberg, which is complex, you will find layers and layers of simple and complicated problems, which lends itself to what what in the literature is called straight through processing, or what in governance terms they're calling rules as code, RAC. If when you unpack these problems, you can actually get a series of if this, then that relationships, which lends itself to solving via code. So the point is, I started with digital infrastructure. Then I said, if it is shared digital infrastructure, when you have that black swan moment, you have something that you can quickly adapt to use. The next level is that if you actually have shared digital infrastructure, which basically means that you have ex ante taken a very hard look at problems and you have codified those parts that lends itself to codification and straight through processing, such that the cognitive load on people can actually be reduced. Look at the talent distribution in your organization, any organization. I invite the Ashoka Fellows to think of their own organization. Your talent distribution is typically a normal curve. It's a bell curve, where the majority of people are actually in the middle of your distribution. You have the extraordinary ones, typically Ashoka Fellows, who would be on the right side of the distribution. Then you have people on the left side of it, completely useless vagabonds. I mean, no right to be there, but yet you tolerate them because what? It lends color or whatever it is. But the fact of the matter is, like we in India tend to do, for every big problem, we are so lazy that we're always looking at people on the right side of the distribution to solve all our problems. But hey, that's actually a very small part of your talent distribution. So if you can have the discipline of unpacking your problems and being able to isolate or peel away those parts that lend itself to rules as code, then what you're really giving to the middle of the distribution is you're making it possible for ordinary people to do extraordinary things. That's how you get safe flying today. Ordinary pilots are giving you very low crash rates. That's the kind of idea, and that's really the power of digital infra, shared digital infra, but also in which you know what needs to be done, and you are not lazy. You're actually worked out and peeled away those parts which are only simple and which are only complicated.
Wow, that was such a fascinating perspective on the terms we use like unbundling, rebundling. You just sort of distilled it down to that there are simple problems that can be in the infrastructure, there are complicated problems which can be in the more the creative environment, and there are complex problems which can be left to some specialist to solve. Everything is not complex. You also brought in a very simple perspective on sharing the ability to solve or distributing the ability to solve, because that ability to solve has to be distributed to the center of the normal distribution curve, rather than distributing the ability to solve to the most competent people, because they actually don't need it. Who needs it is the mass, because that is where scale comes from. So a fascinating perspective. Santosh ji, you and I could keep going, but I have to also be mindful that there are lots of participants who are waiting to ask some questions. So we'll take a short pause, few minutes, and take 2 or 3 questions and then get back to our discussion. So friends, any questions that you have, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask Dr. Santhosh Mathew, who's right here.
Hi, can I?
Yes, Avik, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. Santhosh, just wanted to kind of understand this question also from your perspective of being in the government sector. Always been wondering more about a lot of our work because it involves the Samaj, Sarkar, and the Bazaar. How do you see? How have you seen programs work with the government where there is also a good amount of involvement of participation from the citizens? Or from especially from the rural areas. Is there some examples that you can kind of share some light on? Or maybe, if not examples, what could be, what's typically the scenario? Either there are challenges or what kind of, how is this whole environment where you feel that we can probably make it work better?
I'm just trying to figure in my mind how I can actually explain this to you. I'm not sure this is what you're looking for, but let me take the example of what happened to a former colleague of mine who left the Gates Foundation. I will not take his name. So he had what is called Provident Fund, right? So a part of his salary was deducted and it was actually put into the Employee Provident Fund organization. Now he left the organization and he was entitled to actually get his money out. Now why I'm saying this is that the problem that citizens feel, either as civil society or as businesses or as individuals transacting with the state, is that there is no there is no predictability in the response of the state. Now, what was the consequence? The rules for him to take his Provident Fund money out is very clear. There was even a digital system onto which he could actually put in the application. And there were 3 to 4 or 5 things that he had to comply with. And he did that 5 times. And every time it got rejected. Then he found out that somebody used to work as my junior in government, heads that organization. So he said, Santhosh, can you please help me? This money is not coming out. So I rang up this guy and said, hey, listen, here is this thing. Check out what's the problem. So he said, sir, leave it with me. Within 48 hours, he did not even put in another application. His money was released. Now, you have digital here. You have processes which are well codified, and yet you have a system that doesn't work. This is what citizens, civil society organizations, and businesses who today deal with the many parts of the state in many countries that they face. In fact, in India, we are very much inspired by the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings. And we do a great deal to be able to improve our score. And I keep telling my colleagues and former colleagues in government, what you guys need to really worry about is the ease of doing business with government. If on the other hand, you're actually applying for the refund of a railway ticket in India, it's again a digital process. There are things that you have to submit. And then what happens? The money automatically hits your bank account. So if I think one area in which much needs to be done, and I think as Ashoka Fellows, if you can throw the spotlight on this. Now, for example, I solved this gentleman's, my friend's problem on Provident Fund, but I'm not leaving it at that. I'm going back to my former junior colleague and I'm telling him, listen, I'm not going to leave you now. Your system actually malfunctioned. You solved it, thank you. But let's do a root cause analysis of why that happened. Why is it that you have ticked all the boxes of digital ex-ante analysis? And why is it that your system fails? Same, remember Malaysian Airlines crashed, spent millions of dollars analyzing the problem. how do we bring that culture? So one of the things that I'm involved with, it's a slight digression, but I hope you'll enjoy it, that one of the things that Sanjay and I are engaged in, and Pramod is on the call, is to actually build the digital infrastructure for government so that people can break silos to come together to solve problems. It's called Mission Karmayogi. So today in government, he was the director general of that particular organization. He's the only one who can solve that problem because he's the DG or people below him. But the digital infrastructure that we are creating allows a person like me, if I'm in government, to actually enter a discussion board, post this, offer to work through a solution, and if I make a real contribution, to be actually recognized for that, irrespective of whether I am in that position or not. So the point that I'm making is that even when we encounter these interactions where state and society interact, where civil society individuals interact with the state, and we find these fault lines, can we bring the power of our analysis? Can we bring our understanding of digital to be able to solve problems so that people are able to interact with a state that is more predictable? Is the way that I would actually hazard an answer to a question, Adik.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Santhosh. Yeah, I think this helps to be able to have that, like you said, the word predictability is the right word, and then being able to use that so that everybody can expect a certain kind of a basic response, knowing that this is what I really want to get from the state. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Avik. I have a question. Shanti, did you have a question? You popped up on the screen.
Yeah. I just, hello, Mr. Mathew. This is Shanti from Enable India. We work for persons with disability, and just something that we've been doing from a societal platform perspective when we're thinking. So I want to see whether it's in line with what you're saying, since disability is cross-cutting across so many ministries, the word that was coming in the mind is mirror for action. That is across all ministries. So we are actually working on a pilot within Enable India, not with the government yet, for an intelligent integrated data store, which is almost like, so each ministry can be separate, each department can be separate. But when you realize that this guy is the one who's got loans from everybody, and there are many who have not gotten loans from any of the departments or whatever, right? What is that can integrate and inform? And then after that, action may be the next step. But can we do that mirror for action? And then once we do the pilot, so are these the kind of things you're talking about, or are we on the right path? And I mean, I'm not trying to discuss our mission, but just as an example.
Shanti, thank you for that question. So in my mind, what you just now said is a problem of registries.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And single source of truth.
I love that word. Single source of truth.
So one of the things that I'm working with the Niti Aayog is for government to develop something called a data governance quality index. What we are trying to do is to rank different departments in Government of India on the way they're looking at data. Now, what you have said is a very classic problem, right? In the sense that, my name is Santhosh Mathew, but I originally am from Kerala, worked in Bihar, Delhi, Missouri. But all these places where I worked, my will be Santhosh Mehta, Santhosh Mahato, Santhosh with the H, Mathew with a double T, all sorts of things happen. The thing is that if you have registries and single source of truth, and these are very powerful words for somebody like me who works inside the state. Let me give you an example. Now, if I have a management information system inside government, based on which I'm getting money released from Government of India. Let's say I'm working in the state of Bihar and I'm trying to get money from Government of Bihar for disability. Let me say that I'm Principal Secretary, Social Welfare. So disability was one of the jobs that I performed when I was in government. So I had to get lots of money from Government of India, right? So I report a certain financial expenditure for me to get more money. So that's one reporting I do. Then I report physical achievement. Another report. Then at the end of the year, as principal secretary, I report to my minister my performance. Now, the great thing in government is I can report one number for financial, which has no relationship with the number for physical, which has no relationship with what I tell my minister I actually did. But imagine if you actually have a single source of truth, the moment you do the physical, the financial is automatically calculated. And through APIs, my performance appraisal system simply picks that up, that single source of truth. Now, what does this do? What it does is that, first of all, fudging becomes a little more difficult. But more importantly, Anil Swarup, great leader of our times, what did he say? He said, administratively feasible, politically salient, and financially viable. It's that administrative fees. What does it do? It immediately reduces load. Administrative burden comes down. The moment you are doing something through APIs and code, 3 reportings actually happen. Now, we don't interrogate the state in this manner. I'm sure you do this in your organization because you're all smart people and you have the resources to do that. Let me tell you, I joined government in 1985. We were an extremely poor government. One of the most prized resources in my office for decades used to be something what we called a Xerox machine, which used to do photocopy. We used to guard it with our life. It's no longer the case. So we are an analog government. Our thinking and mentality is one of scarcity, where the digital possibilities and these concepts are not yet muscle memory for us. That's the transformation that we have to bring about, and that's what people like you should help engender in your governments. Thank you
so
Shanti.
much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that,
Just
Santhosh. There are a bunch of questions coming up on the side, but before we go there, you just now mentioned this mentality of scarcity and the role of digital in making, you have talked about this, the role of digital in making pivotal scarce resources abundant. One of the reasons why we should embrace the shared digital infrastructure is to deal with this kind of a scarcity mindset. And today also you talked about the role of data and the 3 cases you gave, and you talked about observability, right? So it would be good to get a sort of a your perspective on what are the key reasons why you are always excited about the shared digital infrastructure, because in the talk you've talked about 3 different pieces. You talked about straight through, you talked about observability, and you have talked about scarce pivotal resources becoming more abundant. What brought you to this construct of these 3 things?
So I want to add one more thing. So first is digital infrastructure. Second is shared digital infrastructure. Third is observability. Fourth is rule as code, straight through processing. A fifth concept I want to introduce is WNTDU, which basically is who needs to do what.
Okay.
Now, if you have digital infrastructure and it is not shared, then you have scarcity. You don't have abundance. When it's shared, that's when you have abundance. And mind you may have, India may be a software powerhouse. I've dealt with government IT projects since 1994. And the kind of trash that is doled out as digital, it's a scandal. I mean, especially when it comes to government. So actually shared digital infrastructure is extremely important. The third is observability. Now, what is the power of observability? The power of observability is that it helps you know what is happening. But that ability to know what is happening is useless in large systems unless you know who has to do what when. Now, I'll pause a moment. Now, if you are just observing 1,000,000 data points, it's useless. You can't make any sense out of it. But if you juxtapose that observability with an insight as to who has to do what when, then you minus one from the other, then what do you get? You basically get that set of who has not done what she was supposed to do. This in management lingo is management by exception.
True.
Management by exception.
At scale.
At scale. So if you have digital, which is shared, which observability is a key feature, where you reduce or you reduce administrative burden by consigning many of the straight-through things that are possible as straight-through processing or role as code, and you can also who needs to do what when, then what you really get, what emerges as cream on top, is your ability to manage large systems by exception. And then when you find that something is not happening, then another concept I'm very much, sort of excited about is the means, motive, and opportunity construct. So when you find that something is not getting done, there are two ways to solve it. In government, how I used to solve it till I came back after my PhD was, I used to deploy the force of my personality, including the power that I have and everything to solve a problem. So what happened? I moved away or somebody else moved away. The whole thing fell like a pack of cards. In fact, we left, our departure meant that the system was worse off than when we actually encountered it. So now, if we are able to deploy these things and do it as management by exception, what you really make possible is to then bring in critical analysis, is that why is a person not able to do what she's supposed to do? Is it a question of means? The person does not know what to do. Is it a question of motive? Is it that the person does not have the motivation, intrinsic or extrinsic? Or is it that the person does not have the opportunity to do that, the rule framework, or the person is not the right person doing the right job? So if you can unpack the problems that you find with all these 5 constructs, and then when you find failures, bring in a means, motive, opportunity analysis, and then you can stabilize it in the 18 months that I talked about. That's when you get systems that will endure. That's when you get systems that will be sustainable. And that's why societal platforms, shared digital infrastructure on its own is pretty useless unless you do these other things that I'm arguing for. Sanjay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why in societal platform thinking, we always say it's the shared digital infrastructure, it is the co-creation environment, and it is the amplification of network effects between people, that you need to get all of these together. Just creating an infrastructure is not adequate to drive the transformation. So that's a great point you made here. I have a bunch of questions coming up. The first one, let me pick up, is from Pramod. So that's going to be an interesting question for you. Pramod asks, saying, we see that government officers making same mistakes again, distrust in people, private entities, overcomplication of process, wanting to control, unwilling to collaborate, etc. And again. And we as a system don't seem to be learning from successful projects, things that have actually happened all right. What's causing this, and what can we do to de-silo the whole system so that we can learn from the successes of other successful projects?
Thank you, Pramod. See, one of the reasons why, according to me, distrust is there is because of a really genuine risk that the government official today encounters. I mean, let me take the example of computers that are supplied to schools. I mean, this actually happened. The chairman of NIIT over dinner once told me in Andhra Pradesh, they had supplied computers to schools along with some training programs, etc. 10 years have gone by and they have not been paid for it. It's some 10 crores or so. And his board kept saying, write off, write off. He said, nothing doing. It is my money. It's the taxpayers' money. I'm entitled, I'll take it. But what is really happening? So because this was spread over a large number of schools, the payment volume becomes high. And when the payment volume becomes high, the approval for payment goes to a higher level. But what is the level at which the person who has to approve that payment, what is the data based on which she approves payment? Is basically a certification by the headmaster of a school and by some technical experts saying computer supplied, specifications are right, it worked from, let's say, 1,200 schools. Now, what is the value addition in that process for this person to then approve payment? What does he do? What does she do? She just sees that somebody will process the file and say 1,200 schools, everybody is certified, payment may kindly be approved. Now, when a file like that comes to me, my hand will shake. Why does my hand shake? Because if I approve this payment, and in 10 schools, it so turns out that receipt for computers was fraudulently obtained, I am toast. My career is finished. Because if you look at the general financial rules and the accountability processes in government, it says you as a person who's approving that payment is squarely responsible for the payment you're approving. Now, people react in different ways. I actually know an officer who would then go to these 1,200 schools and personally check this before approving payment. Now, is that feasible? On the other hand, the person who is approving that, or rather a person who is certifying the supply of computers, is quite relaxed because she knows, listen, the big boss is signing, so in case anything goes wrong, big boss will ensure nothing happens to me because big boss doesn't want to go to jail. So it is the interaction between these subsystems and the way accountability is currently being processed within government, which actually, if you ask me, diffuses accountability, that you end up having a system which shows up to you as being distrustful. It shows up to you as being obnoxious, unreliable behavior on my side. But we have not taken the pains to unpack it. And frankly, this can actually be solved by just doing a digital escrow. What do? Every person approves and there is no person sitting on top because the conditions for approval are ex ante agreed. And code simply releases the money when all the conditions are met. So if something goes wrong, then the locus of accountability is very sharply placed on that person who provided the false certification. But Pramod's question is much deeper than that. I only covered this point of distrust. But the question of why is it that we are not able to replicate success, there the question is much deeper and the problem is much wider. I was very fortunate to have Pramod and Sanjay's company and Nandan and all to work together to try and solve these problems. But how many officials have the luxury of this partnership? In fact, one of the things that I soon realized when I came back to my PhD is that government money, there are 4 kinds of money. Government money, quite large and plentiful, but very inflexible money. On top of that sits money that comes from bilateral donors. Because of the distance between the aid giving country, you get little more flexibility. On top of that sits the multilateral money, which is when countries come together, pool the money into multilateral organizations, World Bank, United Nations, ASEAN, those kinds of money are little more flexible. And on top of that sits the most precious and that little money, which is philanthropic money, which is where I now sit. And that's my entire sort of effort, is that if you really want to replicate success, if you really want to move big things, which are population scale and involves government, you need the right blend of the tax dollar, the bilateral dollar, the multilateral dollar, and the philanthropic dollar. And it is to come up with the right mix of monies with the right element of flexibilities, and then harvesting all the digital possibilities and these things that really is for me the recipe for success. Or rather, I'm not saying that this is a necessary condition, but is a necessary condition for success. Sanjay.
Thank you. That was a brilliant point on the role of different kinds of funding and the catalytic role of philanthropic capital. Manu had another interesting question, which is sort of related to this topic, which is how can government and civil society create trust for use of digital infra, which say has been created by civil society? So you use philanthropic capital and the civil society creates the infra, and now the government has to trust it, that this is trustworthy and adopt that infra. How do you make that happen?
I mean, you guys are the experts on that. I mean, who, I mean, Diksha is a very good example of that. iGot is a very good example of that. But let me tell you, the key really is not on digital infra. The key really is on where the digital infra will be hosted. That really is the key. So I have, today you have you have security audits. You can have third-party validation. So you can take apart code and have it examined from every angle. But that lurking suspicion that this code is meant for something, most of that can be dealt with, is my own sense of it. But where the problem really comes in is when you actually construct something which has to be hosted on hosting infrastructure that is not government owned. And I'll tell you what the problem is. And Pramod is really at the vanguard of trying to solve for this. And recently he's had some huge success. Government hosting infrastructure is woefully inadequate. They are really not fit for purpose. They don't have the systems. They don't have the expertise to be able to actually solve for it. So what Pramod has been trying to do is to actually build the capacity through real live example of hosting something as massive as Sunbird, which is in the form of iGot. And we've been at this since at least the last 3 to 4 months. Very difficult steps. And COVID has been again a problem. But if Pramod succeeds, which I'm sure he will, in fact, he has succeeded because we've already got the login. And we actually are able to make it possible for government to seamlessly host some of these complex systems and demonstrate that government can actually do that, then one of the biggest barriers for government using civil society produced a code can actually be solved for. That's number one. Number two is that allow government to fail. Allow government to feel the pain of failure. Allow government to really want to experience that pain and then come in like a knight in white shining armor to solve for the problem. You will be much better received. But the problem is very few of us have the patience or the ability to spot these opportunities when they occur. I mean, this is almost like, hunting for game in the wild, because these opportunities have a very nice way of camouflaging themselves that, you'll be standing in front of that opportunity and you won't recognize it. For example, today, digitally disrupting healthcare is an opportunity staring at us in the face. Whereas the entire narrative inside government is how do you build more hospital beds? How do you get more oxygen plants? And it's all on building infrastructure. Ola or Uber, I'm not sure how many cars they own, but they digitally disrupted that place so that efficiencies were possible to be harnessed from all sides. The point that I'm making is, if you have that patience, if you have that insight, this is a problem that can be solved, provided the hosting problem can be dealt with. Of course, countries to countries, things will differ. And I apologize that my own examples and lived experience is that from India. Sanjay.
Fascinating, fascinating. A very interesting question from Sarah, which is a little, I'm taking it up because it's a little different question to sort of make the discussion a little wider. You talked about your research on the distribution of capacity or distributing the ability to solve, if you will. Can you talk about some interesting references or some way for this audience to learn more about how do you, in a large complex system, how do you distribute capacity and distribute the ability to solve?
Yeah. Let me take the example of what our relationship began with, which was the National Council for Teacher Education. It's a live example. So the National Council for Teacher Education is a regulatory body. So the job of this body is to regulate about 20,000 plus teacher training colleges and institutions in the country spread across the length and breadth, the vastness of India. And about 90% of them are privately owned. Many of them are just building with no faculty and a lot of students who don't go for any classes. They sit at home, they pay money, it's a single window transaction, and the degree comes home in good time. So the regulatory effort on that was the humongous task. And let me tell you what this whole thing of distributing the ability to solve, how one actually began to approach the problem. So while unpacking the regulatory requirements, one found that the current regulatory environment was teacher trainers are sent from one institution to inspect another institution. So what did that mean? It meant that one non-existent institution's non-existent teacher was going to another non-existent institutions to actually inspect them and certify that they're all right. Will this work? And the argument that was being made is that you need expert teachers to go there to figure out if the quality of instruction is good. So what did one do? Unpack the problem and said, yes, of course you need to figure that out. But for that, you don't need a teacher to go to another place. You just need the data. So let's construct a shared digital infrastructure which will be incumbent on the teacher training college to use, starting from recruitment of students, recruitment of faculty, to payment of salaries, to library issuance of books, to assignments, to marking. The entire digital workflow is made available by the regulator, and they are given the opportunity. I mean, these are standards. You can build your own. We'll give you APIs. If you don't have, here is ours. Use it. And I will simply watch the data. And from pattern recognition, superimposed on some data collection exercise. So what we then, therefore, the inspection program was not a scholarly, non-existent scholarly teacher going to a non-existent institution. It was simply a crack data collection team, which is actually going there through multiple levels of randomization, anonymization, and all of that. And what we were capturing was videography, checking the data points to see whether in reality what was showing up in the digital exhaust was actually happening there or not. And then what happened was this data was brought to a central lab where the few expert teachers we had in the country, this was the design, by the way, I lost my job before I could implement this or rather I quit by then, whatever the reason was. I had about 700 cases in all the high courts filed against me against this process. But I'm just talking of the design, how distributed ability to solve can solve for this. So then what happens is that all the data, the video, everything is examined in a lab environment, anonymized to the extent that's possible, and then double blind checked as to whether what category it would come to. And then our rankings and our certification process would then be released. So what really happened was we distributed the ability to solve by making those complex processes actually just simple and complicated. So it actually we put in place shared digital the idea was to put in place shared digital infrastructure that will capture the exhaust. We then send not teachers, but just verification auditors who knew nothing about teaching. They just checked whether the data points were actually real or not. And whatever teaching they had to capture was actually videographed. And they were all brought back to the lab. And then I said talent distribution, right side, middle, left side. So I used the middle of the distribution for distributing and used the right side of the distribution for those crucial tasks. And then as these processes were done through multiple iterations, we were then able to, the idea was, I mean, we didn't succeed as yet, but the design was we would then be able to find those people who are then very astute at coming up with the right kind of classification again and again. So what the point is to increase the number of people we had on the right side of the distribution. So if you, the point that I'm making is that if you actually have the digital infrastructure, it's possible to distribute the ability to solve. And this is one example which I thought is straight from what I was trying to design. I hope it is helpful, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Santoshji. By the way, the time that you had generously kept for us is all taken, and we have been fascinatingly enjoying this conversation. And I want to be respectful. It's late in the night for you. So I just wanted to do one last question. There are some very accomplished social entrepreneurs on this call, broadly from about 14 countries. If you were to reflect back on the last many years of your experience in government and your experience with platforms, what is that you would tell them to do more of, and what is it that you'll tell them to do less of? From your heart, straight from your heart, from your real lived experiences. Do more of this and do less of that.
Stop evaluating government from the outside. Dirty your hands. Get in there. There are in every government in every country, there are both politicians and civil servants who really would love to make a contribution and leave a legacy. Find them. Work in partnership with them in such a way that your understanding of societal platforms, of shared digital infrastructure, your understanding of simple, complex, and complicated tasks, your understanding of talent being a normal distribution, these understandings make it possible for these reform champions inside to work in partnership with you to curate success, and then take these examples to other parts of the same government and to other parts of the world. That's our recipe for success. Patience, endurance, willingness to take your insights, but over the medium term. I mean, I first came, and I used to be the registrar for Aadhaar in Bihar, and that was 2010. Yeah, 2010. This is 2021. We are still partnering. So that's what I mean by patience. By the way, I just noticed that Rikin Gandhi is there, and he is the master of all of this. His digital green. I've seen his work, and I'm sure there are many others here who know much more than me in these things. So I'm delighted I was preaching to the choir.
Thank you so much, Santhoshji. It's always inspiring to listen to you, to learn from you. I wish we could, if these were non-COVID times, we would have had you for a day, and then it would have been a very different experience altogether. But surely those days will come. Thank you so much. We wanted to really extend our gratitude for the learnings today and assure you that the team on this call and beyond is on a mission to make a difference at scale, and we would be interacting again. Like you said, it's only been 11 years and there will be 11 more to come because the task at hand obviously is a very large and complex task. So thank you so much for your kind perspectives as well as sharing the time with us. Take care.
Thank
And
you.